This is the third lecture for week 3, and this lecture looks at the aspect of socialization regarding the agents of socialization. So who are the sources of socialization? This lecture looks at different agents of socialization, including families, schools and childcare, employers, peers, community, and media. So I'll just take a minute to remind you of this diagram that comes from your reader, and I mentioned in the previous lecture that we started by looking at socialization in terms of the outcomes. So socialization, again, is how an individual learns the rules, the standards of behavior, the expectations to belong to a society or a group or a family. And so outcomes of socialization include things like developing certain morals or attitudes, behaviors, values, and understanding of the self, self-esteem, and self-concept. So this lecture will now look at the sources of socialization, who's giving people messages, the individual messages about socialization, and that includes agents like parents, siblings, relatives, etc., the family, peers, and this lecture will emphasize the kinds of aims and outcomes that are associated with different agents of socialization. So a few points to make about socialization agents. So different sources of socialization, different agents of socialization have different kinds of influence depending on where the individual is in their lifespan, in their process of development. So you can think about in early childhood, the family is really the most important source of socialization. And moving into the middle childhood and adolescent years, peers become a more important source of socialization. And then as people become young adults and enter into middle and older adulthood, employers are an important form of socialization, romantic partners, the society, the larger society through media, these all assume different kinds of importance at different points in the lifespan. Agents of socialization may complement or contradict each other. So for example, if you think back to the ecological model from the first lecture, a child is simultaneously within a family and a school and a peer network. And you can imagine that sometimes a school might try to socialize a child in a certain way that complements what the family is trying to do. So if there's reinforcement in the home for the kinds of behaviors that the school is looking for, like good study habits and being well self-regulated and having good self-control, but you might also see contradictions. There may be times that an agent of socialization, like a peer, might contradict what a parent wants. So a peer might encourage risky behaviors in an individual, whereas parents might be encouraging more cautious behaviors. So sometimes a particular individual gets conflicting messages, and then it's really a question about which agent of socialization is more important in that time of that individual's development. And then another point is that socialization agents change their practices and views over time in reaction to or result of a societal change. So this is really the chronosystem element that was mentioned in the first lecture related to the ecological model. People are socialized to live in the time at which they are living. So the way you're socialized to be a person now, it really has to do with living in this historic moment. So you're socialized to use media and technology, for example, which wouldn't be part of how you would be socialized as a student even 20 years ago. So the particular historic moment has bearing on how someone is socialized. And to that last point, you might just think about an important source of socialization for children is schools. So children, and I'll talk about this more later in the lecture, but in schools help children learn the knowledge that they need to function as adults. They learn behaviors, they learn skills, and you might think about how schools were, let's say 100 years ago in the picture on the left, versus how schools are now. Schools have changed a lot. So you might think of some of the changes over the last 100 years, things like co-educational schools. You might have had boys and girls more likely to be separated previously. You might have had people learning different types of things, maybe more likely to learn Latin or have religious studies in a public school than you would see today. versus today, of course, children are more likely to be using computers as they are on the right, and maybe more likely to be doing group projects or independent work. So there's clearly a way that people are socialized around what the outcomes are that they need to live in the time that they live in. Now I'm going to turn to talking about the different agents of socialization and the different types of aims and outcomes that may be associated with those agents of socialization. And really the agents of socialization match up to the first lecture, the discussion of the microsystems. So agents of socialization are those people and those contexts that people experience that are close to them, that are the micro, the small types of environments. Those are the most influential in terms of socializing people. So starting with different agents of socialization, the family is an important source of socialization for particularly children to learn about what it means to belong to a family and the different groups that that family belongs to, including the larger society. So of course families, they have responsibility for a child and they have responsibility for educating their children in terms of socializing them to what the expectations are in terms of the groups they belong to. And so children gain their culture and their socioeconomic status from their parents, and often there are values, norms, and practices that are associated with belonging to a particular culture and also belonging to a socioeconomic status. So, parents are the ones who teach their children, what is important, like how they should behave, and practices like how you interact with others, and what it means to be a girl or a boy. And another piece is around racial and ethnic socialization. So what does it mean to belong to a particular culture? And how can you be prepared if the culture you belong to is the object of racism or sexism? So parents are the ones who have to prepare their children for that aspect of living in the world as well. So the family has a very important task in terms of socializing children around what it means to belong to the groups they belong as a family. So schools and childcare are another source of socialization. So thinking first of childcare and young children, childcare is a place where children often have their first important peer relationships, and so they learn what it is to be a friend, to interact with others, learn how to do things like behaviors like sharing, learn, how to have the self-control, the self-regulation to be able to sit through circle time. And then that continues on into schools where children learn the kinds of knowledge and skills that are imparted by schools. So they learn how to write, they learn how to read, how to do maths. They learn important knowledge, what it means, the history of Australia, that is part of helping them understand what it is to be an Australian. They learn customs like taking turns and queuing up, not pushing other people. And children, they learn beliefs as well. So they learn beliefs like having an achievement orientation, so that you're encouraged to achieve and have academic achievement. And schools have a big influence in terms of shaping someone's goals, letting people know what they might do as an adult. And then that continues on in the kind of school when people continue on beyond their K through 12 education to universities. As you are learning as a student, you're learning about what you might want to do in the world, and that's shaping the kind of goals that you may have for your career and your life. One way that schools and childcare and universities socialize people is by offering a kind of evaluation according to a norm. So being clear about what is expected in terms of behaviors and achievement, and then measuring people's performance against those standards. So people know, therefore, I'm measuring up, I'm not measuring up, I need to work harder, I need to try more. And so in order to achieve the kinds of skills that are being asked for. And schools and childcare are also a source of models to imitate. So you can imagine the model can be a peer or the model can be a teacher. So those agents of socialization that are really powerful are the ones that people have a feeling of connection to. So when children have a feeling of connection to their teacher or to their peer, there's a desire to want to imitate and please that model. And we'll talk more about imitation as really a method of socialization in the next lecture. So as I mentioned in the second lecture, socialization is really something that's most intensive during childhood and then in adolescence, but it's really a lifelong process. So employers are very explicit in terms of socializing people. And so you are socialized to be an employee in whatever context you're in. You're socialized to be within a particular trade or profession, and also to be part of a particular organization. So a lot of the process, a lot of what happens when you start a new job is learning, what are the rules in this new place? What are the standards of my behavior? What's expected of me? And so there's socialization by employers around the expectations for what you're meant to achieve in that particular role. What are appropriate behavioral norms? So how are you meant to act towards your peers, towards your supervisors, towards maybe the people you serve? So you can imagine if the employer is, if you're in a cafe, you're taught the appropriate behavioral norms towards your customers and to act towards them in a certain way. And then there's often training from employers about how to develop certain kinds of competencies and skills. So people are socialized also to know certain things, to have certain types of skills, often through on-the-job type of training. Peers are an important source of socialization, really throughout our lives, but most importantly during the adolescent years when young people are really forming their identities, and then there's a huge influence often from peers. So peers can offer each other an experience that's very different than what an adult can offer to a child, for example. So two peers who are two children or two adolescents are having an experience where one is not taking care of the other. There's more independence and it's more egalitarian. So there's not necessarily a clear distinction about who's in charge. That may be something that's worked out in a peer group. And we'll talk about that more in middle childhood and adulthood, or in adolescence, when we look at peer relationships. But the peers offer the opportunity, distinct from that of adult-child relationship, of having more independence and being on more equal footing. But peers are they really regulate the behavior of other people who are other peers by rewarding certain behaviors and rejecting or punishing other types of behaviors. So you think about this with adolescents, when peers are so powerful, you might be rewarded for dressing in a certain way, talking in a certain way, and rejected for looking or talking in a different way. So that's a kind of socialization, the operant method of socialization of punishment and reward that comes from peers. And a lot of how we think about ourselves and our identity, we get messages from our peers about, are we okay? Are we good? Are we bad? Are we good at certain things? Are we popular, unpopular? A lot of how people think about themselves comes from the kinds of messages they get from peers. And peers can offer each other support, and that's a different kind of support than the kind of support that a adult gives to a child. Can be a kind of emotional support that's available from peers as well. Communities are another source of socialization, for children and adolescents in particular, but older ages as well. So communities can be a source of belonging, can create a feeling in terms of identity formation that one belongs in a place and can have feelings of support and offer friendship, or can offer the opposite. So communities can create a feeling of isolation if people are not socially connected. Communities can offer examples of behavioral norms. So if you think about showing up in a particular neighborhood, you'll be observing what other people are doing in their neighborhood, in their community, and seeing, what does it mean to be an adult? Are there people here with jobs? What kind of jobs do they have? Are there people here who are engaging in criminal behaviors? That's something that might be observed in a particular community. So how do people conduct themselves? Particularly for children, communities can offer those kinds of cues around behavioral norms. And communities also offer access to services and to facilities like schools. So schools are embedded within communities, and they're often influenced by what's important in that community. So if a particular community really values high achievement, then the school might really reflect that. So I'm just thinking right now of Silicon Valley, near where I'm from in San Francisco, and where Stanford University is and a lot of technological innovation. There's some very high achieving people who live in that area, and there are community expectations that people will be high achieving, and that gets translated into schools as well. And so expectations and motivations can be conveyed that way when a lot of people are living together and share a set of values. The media is another powerful source of socialization, really maybe throughout our lives, but of course particularly for children who are more impressionable. So media offers information about society, and you might even watch a media from other countries, and it gives you some kind of sense of what's important in that society when you see things like how women are depicted. Italy has been sort of famous for having television that really seems to show women as sort of sexual objects primarily. So that's been a critique, of media in Italy, and a question about what does that suggest about the society's values. You can look at other countries and what does their media value. You can say a lot of the media from the U.S., for example, might value violence. And that's part of American society and having to protect yourself. So there are messages about society that come from media. And also media is a big source of role models. So and when children have connections to characters, they want to be like those characters. So we'll talk about that in the tutorial when we'll talk about, for example, Disney and the Disney princes and princesses, how those might be role models for children, and how, if you follow the media, if you try to be like someone in the media, how does that influence your behavior? So there's also like the Kardashians who might be role models for adolescents and for young adults. So wanting to emulate someone like Kim Kardashian and dress in a certain way and act in a certain way. So media can be a source of socialization, particularly through influencing what people think about the society and offering role models. So back to this diagram, I'm sort of using this diagram to link our different lectures. So now we've talked about the socialization agents, and the fourth lecture for this week and the final lecture will now look at the methods of socialization. So we've been sort of working backwards, and now we'll look at these different types of socialization methods and how they influence behavior and outcomes.